Hi friends, welcome back to our YouTube series, What Can My Kids Read Right Now? This is part 2, in which we're covering graphic novels available on Hoopla as of April 2020.
We discussed this more in our previous video, but our databases, including Hoopla, which we're talking about right now, does require a library card in order to access those databases. The good news is, even though our Caroline Kennedy Library and our John F. Kennedy Jr. Library are physically closed due to coronavirus, our electronic resources are always available, and if you do not have one already, we can issue you a temporary library card as long as you live, work, or go to school in the city of Dearborn Heights. All you need to do is submit your request via email to dhrreference@gmail.com and give us your name, address, and telephone number, and we will be able to send you a card number for temporary use of our databases. Before getting into our list of recommendations, one thing we need to cover are reader levels. So many of you are familiar with either Lexile, Accelerated Reader, things of that nature. Mr. Jim and I do not use those classification systems. They're great classification systems, but the problem becomes that every school district tends to use their own, and every reader uses their own. So what we do is we use a much more loose definition of readers, and we really have two groups. We have our emerging readers and our independent or experienced readers. Our emerging readers are still learning and practicing reading techniques and may need help with more difficult words and concepts. If you're checking physical items out of the library, emerging readers tend to read early chapter books or easy readers. And easy readers are those books that are tagged with those blue library tags. So if your reader is either in early chapter books or uses those blue library tag books, you're going to look for emerging reader recommendations. Independent and experienced readers are comfortable with reading on their own and do not need help very often. They recognize more complicated vocabulary and concepts. Their books are often longer chapter books and tend to be more complex, both with words, vocabulary, and concepts. So if your reader is specifically in our chapter book section, using more advanced chapter books, or is even in our YA area, you're going to look for those recommendations for independent and experienced readers.
A note about content. Often, content that is designed for independent and experienced readers also tend to be designed for older readers. So, this content can deal with tough stuff sometimes, like illness, death, people having different kinds of crushes on people, divorce, sometimes monsters, sometimes violence. So, these are more mature themes that tend to come along with those stories that are designed for older or more mature readers. So, we always encourage you to be aware of what your child is reading and whether it reflects the contents and themes that you are comfortable with them exploring. But don't necessarily be afraid to have your child reading that more mature content because it gives you a great jumping off point for discussions with your children. It can make the reading not only a family adventure, but a way to explore these ideas with your child by talking about the story and exploring the actions and the consequences of the actions of the characters in what they're reading.
Just one more thing to talk about before we move forward with our graphic novel recommendations, and this is true for graphic novels as well as any other type of reading. So it's a note about that emerging reader content that we're recommending. So this material that's recommended for emerging readers can also be enjoyed by your older reader. A lot of times kids and teens love to revisit older classics or revisit things that they remember enjoying or just enjoying a work that isn't particularly challenging for them to read. We use reluctant readers a lot in the library, and that just means that these are readers that the idea of reading a book isn't the first on their list for an activity they want to do. From anywhere from that to downright having to argue and deal with lots of upset children, making them read something. So reluctant readers can often be convinced to read emerging reader titles. So we really encourage you to not keep older readers away from emerging reader content just because it's a little bit easier, because this can still be things that those older readers really enjoy and can stop some of the reading battles at home. Our first set of recommendations for emerging readers are from television shows. It's Steven Universe and the Powerpuff Girls. Just in case you're not familiar, Steven Universe is the coming-of-age story told from the perspective of Steven, who's the youngest member of the Crystal Gems, who are a team of magical guardians who protect the world from the evil gem home world. It's lots of magic, lots of fun. It's very sweet stories. The Powerpuff Girls are also based off of a television show about three young girls, Blossom, Bubbles, and Buttercup, how they obtain their unique powers, they become superheroes, and they join forces to foil the evil mutant monkey Mojo Jojo's plans to take over the world. This is our emerging readers video games category. So these are both games that your kids are very familiar with. You're probably also very familiar with. Sonic the Hedgehog has been a game that's been around since the 90s. It's pretty ubiquitous as far as characters that your kids might be familiar with are concerned. There was also a Sonic the Hedgehog movie really quite recently, so this might be something on the forefront of their mind. There's also Plants vs. Zombies, which in the library, these tend to be really, really popular with emerging readers. They recognize the characters from the mobile games or the desktop games, and they tend to be pretty fun, pretty goofy stories. So if your emerging reader really wants to read something that has more action and you're not really happy with a lot of violence and gore and stuff of that nature, Plants vs. Zombies is a really good in-between ground. Our other comics graphics category for emerging readers has two recommendations. Firstly, the story of Diana, Princess of the Amazons. So if your child is a fan of the Marvel Universe or the DC comic universe, Diana, Princess of the Amazons is the story of Wonder Woman. So if you have a comic book fan at home, and again, you're running into the trouble of not all comic book based stories may be appropriate for your reader, this can be a great way of letting them read those comic book heroes, but something that's geared more towards their age. And of course, Garfield, because everyone loves our favorite feline from newspaper comics. This is our last series of recommendations for emerging readers, and that is our graphic style chapter books. So several of these, especially Big Nate and Geronimo Stilton, have chapter book adventures as well as graphic novel adventures. So some of them that we would recommend for emerging readers are Big Nate, Geronimo Stilton, and Cece, A Fairy's Tale. Our first recommendation for independent readers is a bit of a slice of life series. So this is Invisible Emmy and Positively Izzy. Both are by Terry Libenson. This is part of a series, and these are great middle school drama, slice of life reads talking about school and friends and crushes and embarrassing moments. Very funny stuff, a very good series. So if Invisible Emmy is a hit at your house, there are more stories to read. These are often recommended for readers that like the Rania Telgemeier books like Drama or Ghosts. So if you have a fan of those at your house, this might be a series that they have not embarked upon yet. These next two recommendations are slice of life works, but they're slice of a little bit of a more complicated life. So our first recommendation is Sheets by Brenna Thumler. Sheets follows the story of Marjorie, a 13-year-old who's in charge of running her family laundry business on top of all the drama of having to go to middle school. Wendell is a ghost, and he's a young ghost, and he starts to haunt their laundry. It's a really interesting exploration of not only Wendell's life, but Marjorie's as well. Our other recommendation is New Kid by Jerry Craft. You may have heard of this already. It is an absolutely wonderful story. I do want to share that when this book first came in, before it started piling up with all of these awards, Mr. Jim read this and told me This is something that is going to be a huge book. This is something that I hope so many of our kids are reading, and he was right. So, New Kid not only won the Coretta Scott King Award and the Kirkus Prize, but it is the very first graphic novel to ever win a Newbery Medal. So this graphic novel really is a big deal, and it follows seventh grader Jordan Banks, who is enrolled in a new prestigious private school, and he realizes that he's one of the only few kids of color in his entire grade, and he starts to feel like he's torn between two different worlds, the world and the community that he's growing up in, and this prestigious private school, and he struggles to fit in and find his place. This is one of those just absolutely wonderful stories, especially for fifth and sixth graders that are looking to explore the world a little bit or may not fit in their own circumstances and would like a story that is relatable.
Often when people think of graphic novels, they think of comic books, and they don't always think of history. But lots of wonderful memoirs and historical stories are told in graphic novel format. And these are two that we wanted to recommend. The first is Marzi. This is the story of a girl, Marzi, born in 1979, 10 years before the end of communism in Poland. So it uses a series of vignettes and short little stories to show her world on the other side of the Iron Curtain, and is a great coming of age story that really puts the reader in Poland in 1979. The other is one of my absolute favorite graphic novels, and this is March. This is by Representative John Lewis, the historical civil rights figure. March is part of a three-part series that tells the story of his life as well as his iconic fights in the civil rights movement, including of course, the historical Selma Bridge incident. This is a really wonderful tool to make history feel lived in and to make it feel alive, not as flat as sometimes photos and history books can make it seem. These are lived in stories by real people, and I absolutely heartily recommend March, and Marzi is also a great story as well. Our final recommendations in this graphic novel series are for what I would call advanced recommendations. These are designed for older, more mature readers. So these are middle school and up. These are stories that feature high schoolers that are learning their place in the world. They're coming of age stories. So they do deal with more mature themes and content. But if your middle school reader is looking for something a little bit more advanced, these are both great series. Goldie Vance is a 16-year-old who lives at a Florida resort with her dad, who manages the resort, and she dreams of becoming the hotel's in-house detective. So Charles, the current detective, encounters a case that he can't crack. So he agrees to mentor Goldie for exchange for help solving the mystery. So this is kind of a riff on a Nancy Drew or a Veronica Mars. So it can be a lot of fun. The other series is Lumberjanes, and this is an entire series written by several different authors, and it follows a group of girls named Mal, Ripley, Molly, April, and Joe as they spend a summer at scout camp. There's also supernatural phenomena that they encounter there, as well as just their own drama about becoming adults and growing up. So these are both great graphic novel series, but they are intended for older, more mature readers. This is the end of our graphic novels on Hoopla video for our series, What Can My Kids Read Right Now? But next in our series is going to be emerging reader stories and chapter books on Hoopla, including Worries Are Not Forever, Cats vs. Robots, and one of Mr. Jim's absolute favorites, Charlie and Mouse. I encourage you to stay connected with us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and of course YouTube, where we have not only this series, but our wonderful stories, our arts and crafts, a book recommendations for adults, and more. I miss you. We miss you. Stay safe.